My name is John, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in today to watch this tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be taking a SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 11 server, joining it to a Windows Server 2008 R2 box that has Active Directory installed onto it. When I say box, of course, I'm referring to server. I was going to go ahead and show you SLES 10, but the tutorial is too long. They're almost identical. SLES 10 and SLES 11 are almost completely identical. I will point out the major differences with the SLES 11. When I say SLES 11, you can also go ahead and say OpenSUSE 11. If you want to use the OpenSUSE version, it's going to be identical as far as this goes. So the very first thing I did is I installed Active Directory on this Windows 2008 server. And then in addition to that, I went to the roles and I scrolled down, a little bit down this page because it's not right up in the summary area. But you install this identity management for Unix. That is necessary for you to do this, and go ahead and do that beforehand before trying to join the domain. So if I go into Active Directory users and computers, let me close these down actually. Okay. Too many windows open. Close that one, and we'll come in here. Okay, so Active Directory users and computers. If I go into computers, I'm going to delete this. I've done this tutorial multiple times. Haven't liked the way it turned out, so I'm redoing it. So I currently don't have any members in this domain. I reverted the snapshot from my Linux box, so I don't have to actually leave the domain on that side. And then I have a few users in here, and that's about it. But if I were to go in to look at my domain users group, for instance, I have a Unix attributes tab, and that's because I installed that identity management for Unix. And inside of here, I selected my NIS domain, which is my NetBIOS name of my Active Directory box, Windows 2008. It has a GID of 10,000. And I can add users in here, but I'm not worried about it right now. But you do have to have a default group for all users that are going to be mapped via WinBind down to the Linux boxes. So go ahead and set up a group. It doesn't have to be the same group for everybody. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at Gomer Pyle. He's a user I created, and if I go into the properties of Gomer Pyle, I can go to his Unix attributes tab. Notice that I'm part of the same domain. I gave him a UID of 10,001, and this other information was auto-populated. And if I didn't have a group here, I wouldn't be able to apply and OK this, if I remember correctly. If I had multiple groups, I'd obviously have a drop-down list of groups I could select from. So we'll say OK, and that is what I need to have done on this side, minus time must be in sync. When you go to do this, time must be in sync on the Windows box, and it must be in sync on the Linux box. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and pull open a PuTTY session to my box. And this is, again, a 11 version of, this is the enterprise version, but basically SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 11 or OES 11 is how you can think of it. So if I were to go and look at this, I want to give you a quick tour. If we go and look at your etc nsswitch.conf and look at the passwd line right here, notice that we have our passwd and group lines have compat, and there's nothing else with them. That's all I want to show you for that for now. Our Kuros file, this is it, etc-krb5.conf. That's just a basic empty file. If you go into your etc pam.d directory and grep winbind in ash for everything, you don't see anything in those files for winbind. If we cat our common account, you see you've got one line that is not a commented line in there. It's that pam Unix line at the very bottom. And then finally, the last file I want to show you is etc samba smb.conf. It's a very basic file. Samba's been installed. That's it. This is what you'll get when you install Samba. There's nothing in there related to the configuration of Active Directory. So again, time needs to be in sync. So let me just double check my time right here, which is good. If your time is not in sync, it'll give you all sorts of grief. So don't let that come and bite you. If you go into your var log samba directory and you were to look at your log.winbindd directory or winbindd file, you'll usually see a message about clock skew too great for Kerberos if you're running into issues that you can't explain, like something should be working but it's not. You may want to go and double check that. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that when we join the domain, our Linux box needs access to the DNS records for the Active Directory server that it wants to join. So we need to point to the DNS server that contains that information. In this case, it is my Active Directory box. So if I go to my etsyresolve.conf, you notice my first name server is different than the other two that I have. That's because it's actually pointing to my Active Directory box, which actually is hosting its own DNS. And when I created the domain, I pointed to that server for the DNS, and so that's where all of my DNS records are for that domain, because we need the records in there. So those are the two things you have to keep in mind: time sync and DNS. Make sure you're pointed to the correct DNS server. With that in mind, you can go ahead and launch YAST and go into what's called the Windows Domain Membership plugin. The Windows Domain Membership plugin is also called the Samba client. So I'm going to pull it up here, Windows. So Windows Domain Membership. If I were to launch YAST 2 with Samba-client, it will pull up the exact same, not the YAST menu, but it'll pull up the plugin as if I had clicked on it. So when this comes up, notice all my little update boxes are up here in the top left if you want to watch that. It verifies the workgroup membership, and then it completes, and what we need to put in here and under the domain or workgroup is our NetBIOS name, Win 2008. And then you have to go and check this. Also use SMB information for Linux authentication. This is the key box to check to basically say, set up Winbind, set up Kerberos, set up PAM, do all this stuff for me when I join the domain. Again, here's the NTP configuration. It is important to be in sync. I can't overemphasize that. So do you want to join the domain? I say yes, and it's going to prompt me for my administrator password for my domains, which I'm going to enter. Very short and simple. I did it for testing purposes, but notice I joined the domain successfully. I want to install Samba Winbind, the Kerberos client, and this other Samba Winbind package. As it does that, it will also configure those files. So that little brief tour I gave you of the files, I'm going to show you the differences now. If you want to look at them in detail, you'll just have to pause the video as I show you the files. After our SUSE config completes here, we'll go ahead and look at that. This is just saying you might have to restart some services due to the changes that were made, which is fine. So let's go look at our NS switch again, VI Etsy NS switch. This is saying which databases do we want to look at. Notice that instead of just compat, we are also now using Winbind to go and pull up information for users. We can go look at our krb5.conf. Now if you had to configure all this stuff manually, it's a pain. It's not very fun, but anyway, just kind of a side note. Notice I've got my default realm and then my realm declared here with all of my information. The rest of the stuff, minus this domain realm, is the default stuff. If you do go create this file manually, notice that there are things that are in caps and some stuff that is in lowercase. This is a case sensitive file. And if we go into our etsypam.d directory and grep Winbind from everything, you notice we have a lot of new lines in here that we didn't have before. If we cat our common account again, you'll notice instead of just that PAM Unix line, we also have two new lines down below. That's just to give you an idea that there are a lot of changes that have been made with this plugin. Doing it without this plugin is a pain. And finally, let's go look at our Samba smb.conf. And the key lines I want to point out to you is the workgroup line at the top here. If you follow me down, the ID map GID, ID map UID, realm, and security equals ADS. Now if you go to like an OpenSUSE version 10, kind of an older version of Samba, even some of the earlier versions of OpenSUSE 11, you can continue to use the ID map GID and UID stuff without issue, but let me show you something. If you run test parm out on the command line, this basically goes and tests the syntax of your smb.conf. Notice those two warnings towards the top. Warning, the IDMap GID option is deprecated. The IDMap UID option is deprecated. So why are we getting deprecated options when using this utility? As far as I understand it, the YAST developers have not caught up with some developers, and they continue to use the older options that you would see on like OpenSUSE 10 and earlier versions of OpenSUSE 11, depending on your Samba version. So just keep that in mind. If you were to set this up on 10, you would pretty much be done, but I would recommend changing the ID map back into the more conventional, latest, greatest stuff, which was what we're about to do. Etsy Samba smb.conf. I'm just going to edit it manually. You can go and do this underneath Yast, but I noticed that that can sometimes make changes to your files if you manually edit it, so I just got in the habit of editing it manually. So what I want to do is first of all comment out this deprecated stuff. We don't need it. It will work currently, but if you go and test in the future, if you like run an update, you might break something if they get rid of it, and then you have to try to troubleshoot what's wrong. So ID map settings is what we want to look at. So the very first thing I'm going to do is set up my ID map backend. There are different versions of the backend. There's an ID map underscore RAD and hash and LDAP and AD and probably some others. I typically will use, I've used only 3 of them. Typically I use the RID and the AD. AD you can use if you have a single domain and you want everything like UIDs and GIDs to map one-to-one. So if it's 10,001 for my Gomer pile user on my AD box, his UID on Linux will also be 10,001. If you use an ID map RID, it won't be the same. It'll be a much larger number. It's calculated with an algorithm and stuff, but you have to use the RID when you're using multiple domains. ID map underscore AD, which I'm showing here, is only good for a single domain. So let's go ahead and configure that now with that in mind. So ID map config. We need our domain name, Win 2008, or our NetBIOS name for our domain, I should say. And then we want a backend of AD, or you could put RID or LDAP or NIS, whatever else you're going to be doing here. I'm going to copy this line because we basically repeat it multiple times, except instead of doing backend, we're going to do a range now. Let me show you something. If I do a range of 100 to 200, let's get that line on there. This says pull all UIDs and GIDs that fall within my range, exclude everything else. So where I have a user ID with a UID, sorry, when I have a user with a UID of 10,001, he will not be included in my WinBind searches. So let's make this something meaningful now. So now he will with this range. And then this bottom line we're going to change to a schema mode. And the schema mode that you'll use is going to be one of 2 things. It'll be either SFU, Domain Services for Unix, which is like on a Windows 2003 box, you have to go and install that package, or Identity Management for Unix, which is like on a Windows 2008 box. In that case, instead of SFU, Sam Frank Utility, you'll use RFC 2307. Now this is going to fail the way it is if I didn't put something else in. But I want to show you a couple of things first. So first of all, where we're dealing with this, let me restart my services. RCSMB stop, RC WinBind stop, name service caching daemon stop. You don't have to do it the way I'm doing it. I'm just doing this based on experience and out of habit. So let me turn off my name service caching daemon for troubleshooting purposes, so I don't have to run into problems with it while testing. So I just basically restarted those services. If I do a wbinfo --u, if I can spell it right, you'll notice I see my domain /users that I have set up. Because I'm dealing with a single domain, I don't want to have to always type in my domain information. So I'm going to edit my smb.conf and just add a setting. Let's go ahead and add it up here so you don't confuse it that it's not required. But WinBind use default domain equals yes. Equals yes. And then we'll just go ahead and restart those services again. wbinfo --u, if I can type it right. And notice that our domain is gone, but we still have our user information. Now, I said this would fail, so if I do this next piece will fail at least. If I do a wb-info space -I, give me the information for Gomer, for instance, it can't do it. If I ID Gomer, it can't find it. If I get in past wd Gomer, I get nothing. So let's go explore why that's the case. So if I were to go and uncomment these ID map, UID, and GIDs, by the way, they have the same range in my current range down here, that would be a bad thing. But if I uncommented them even with the same range, everything will work. You'll want these ranges to be different. If I were to change these ranges and uncomment them, everything will work. If you were to go to look at the man page for smb.conf and go and look for ID map, GID, and UID, it'll tell you what it does, but it says these have been deprecated in favor of the following, and this is what it is in favor of. ID map, config, asterisk, basically everything outside of my Windows 2008 domain. Let's put in a range equals 1000 to 9999. Notice that my range does not overlap with this range. You don't want them to overlap. So this is the key to get this to work after you comment out these lines. So don't forget that, otherwise you'll run into the problems I just showed you. Okay, so now let's restart our services. Now if we do wb-info-u, we'll see all of this information here. If we do wb-info-I, Gomer, it's not working, so let's go make sure that our clock skew isn't too great. var log Samba, badlog.winbind. It is saying our clock skew is too great. That may be causing us problems, but we've done what we need to do in order to get it to work. So Gomer, let's see if it's still sucking down the information. Okay, so now I ID'd my user. I think it was still pulling down the information. You notice I can wb-info Gomer, ID Gomer, getInt, pass wd Gomer. Now let's try the krbtgt user, which is not a user I created. It will fail. ID krbtgt. It's not found. Why is it not found? I'll just take you back in here and review this. Oh, I don't even know where that user's at. It's probably right in front of me and I can't see it. But we'll go ahead and create a brand new user and we'll call him John. Actually, let's not call him John. Let's call him hello, I guess. So we're going to give this user a password real quick. Okay, so that. And we created that user hello, and if we were to go and test, let's restart Winbind again. If we were to go and test wb-info-u, now notice this is going to take a second. Winbind isn't always quick, but it came back. Notice we see our hello user now. If we'd ID hello, it won't work. If we come back in here though and we look at our properties, you'll notice that there's nothing set up under the Unix attributes. So if you want them to work, you do have to go in and configure this. This is a requirement. So we'll say apply, okay. We're going to go ahead and restart our services again so that Winbind can get a nice fresh look at everything. Now we see our user, and again this information can take a little bit of time to populate, so we'll see if we can ID him. We cannot ID him yet. Let's just give it some time. I was waiting for Winbind to populate that information and it wasn't, so I ended up off screen just restarting Winbind again. I didn't do anything else, and my hello user showed up. So if you have to, go ahead and restart that Winbind service again. So anyway, if I were to ID all of these users, as you can see right above here, I'm getting all of the information. Everything is mapped. notice that my hello user has a UID of 10,004. That is the same on the Active Directory box, and that's because we are using an ID map underscore AD backend as specified down here at the bottom. So I recommend using this utility, first of all, the Samba client, Samba-client utility under YAS, also known as the Windows Domain Membership Client, to do the bulk of the configuration for you. Realize that the settings that the YAST utility puts in here are deprecated settings, so go ahead and comment those out. Add your backend down here at the bottom and everything should work just fine. I may do an RID backend. Actually, I was thinking about doing it here, but I may do an RID backend. It's basically the same thing, except you would maybe have another option like a base RID. It's got to do an algorithm based off of your range and your base RID. If you were to go and set up the RID on multiple servers, as long as your range and your base RID are the same, then whatever mapping the user gets on server A, he will also get on server B. It won't match the UID, for instance, of what it is in the Active Directory, but all of the Linux servers will match. So that's the big difference between the RID, and you can do multiple domains that way. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments, and I'll try to answer them if I can. But you can see that this utility makes your life a lot easier if you can use it. Go ahead and use it to configure your Active Directory setup, and then just make your tweaks, as I said. Thanks for watching.